Well, if everyone will mute themselves, we'll be ready to begin. Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production brought to you by the Center for Global Justice. I'm your host for today, Cliff Durand. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro por la Justicia Global, is a multinational and multilingual research and learning center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. We aim to promote a more just and peaceful world and promote a solidarity economy. Normally, our programs have been in person until the pandemic forced us to begin these online webinars, and as a result, we don't have the revenue that we normally did. So in order to be able to continue to offer these webinars, we ask that you donate. You can do so by going to our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Our speaker today is Harry Targ, a political scientist who's been a guest on webinars on a number of times. Today he will be rethinking the peace movement today. And what we used to call the peace movement is facing an extraordinary array of problems in 2022. The war in Ukraine is escalating, and combatants are talking about the use of nuclear weapons. How to address the escalating conflict, debates about root causes, understanding imperialism, etc., are subject to debate, even among the US left. US military spending has at least tripled since the dawn of the new century, and the culture and economics of militarism is penetrating US society, now perhaps more than ever. A new Cold War is being discussed, with the United States escalating tensions, not only with Russia, but with China as well. And voices from the global South are raising demands that progressives envision international relations in a new way, not just in terms of great power conflicts, but violence and exploitation from the global North against the global South. Harry Targ is a former coordinator of the Purdue University Committee on Peace Studies, an activist with the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism, member of the Steering Committee of Wisconsin Peace Action, and essayist at Diary of a Heartland Radical. He will address the issues facing the peace movement today and how they that movement or movements have responded. After his presentation, there'll be an opportunity for you to raise questions and share your ideas and experiences about revitalizing the tradition of peace movements. So now, let me give the floor to Harry.
There he is.
Okay, Harry lost his connection. He's
Right.
now coming back online. Okay, Harry, unmute yourself and the floor is yours.
Okay, phew. Hi, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, now I have to figure out how to find my PowerPoint. Okay, share screen, host a stable PowerPoint, so
Looks like it's all back up.
now I need the PowerPoint clip. Host disabled participant screen sharing.
If the moderator would make Harry a co-host, he would be able to share his screen.
Okay, let's see.
You are a co-host now, Harry.
Okay, now I have to find the right one. There it is. Oh, okay. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm sorry for the problems. You all can see me and hear me and
Yes.
okay, welcome. Such aggravation. I'm old enough to remember the old days when you just walked into a room and put an outline on the blackboard and then talked about the outline. And it was much more reliable than this system. But welcome today. I'd like to say a few things about where the world is today, and say a little bit about the peace movement as it exists and might exist. To begin with, when Cliff and I thought about this topic for today's session, what came to mind, at least for me, was a series of core questions that are listed here. First, we have the situation of the war in Iraq, which is escalating, and day by day we see more and more reports of reference to nuclear capabilities, assessing whether either side would be using nuclear weapons. And from my point of view, thinking back, it's hard to think back to 1962, but I'm as frightened today about the danger of nuclear war as I remember being in 1962. Someone suggested that since I'm much older now, I feel much more vulnerable than I did then, but be that as it may. Secondly, there's been an enormous and continued an enormous increase in military spending. And what I want to argue near the end of this presentation is that we see a new round of military penetration of American domestic institutions, not unlike the onset of the Cold War. I'm a recent retiree of an R1 engineering-oriented university, and we see the incredible increase in our university's commitment to military research in collaboration with the Big Five military contractors. Third, there's no question that we're seeing a resumption of Cold War, what many people are calling a new Cold War, with China as the primary adversary and Russia as the secondary adversary. And I'll illustrate some of the language used by this administration to document that. And finally, I have a link to a short video that probably I won't get to show from Vijay, a presentation by Vijay Prashad at COP26 conference, where he argues that a fundamental, maybe the most fundamental conflict in world affairs is not between the big powers, but between the North and South. And each of these elements, I want to argue, are of critical importance for trying to piece together, renovate the peace movement in 2022. If we look first at an illustration of what I think is the general direction of President Biden's foreign policy, a really good illustration was the issuance of a document last week called the National Security Strategy document. Each president is obliged to issue such a statement. I forgot how often periodically, whether it's annually, biannually, or every 4 years. I do remember that President Bush's 2002 document introduced the concept of preemptive war. Well, President Biden issued the National Security Strategy document just last week. And I think it clearly illustrates the cosmology, if you will, the worldview underlying American foreign policy. And I want to argue also that it's not new. It's a continuation of a long period of a long set of visions of American policy, really going back to the 1940s. In terms of the general characteristics of US foreign policy, the document said, we will effectively compete with the People's Republic of China, the only competitor with both the intent and increasingly the capacity to reshape the international order. The document paid homage to Russia. We have to constrain a dangerous Russia, but China was the primary enemy. The document said, in general, that the United States will engage in a dual-track approach to international relations. On the one hand, trying to create a rules-based international order, and secondly, to deepen cooperation with democracies. But a centerpiece, as I will show as we go through this, was the conception of the Biden administration of the United States' deep conflict with an industrializing, globalizing China. A second feature of this document that concerns me is that the document refers to the need to invest at home as well as abroad. Promoting and maintaining democracy in countries like the United States and our friends, democracies around the world, are at the core. But these items that I quote directly, I think, get at the heart of American foreign policy. The power of the private sector with a modern industrial strategy that makes public investments in our workforce, strategic sectors, and supply chain, especially in critical and emerging technologies. And the document says we have to modernize our military, pursue advanced technology, and invest in our defense workforce to best position America to defend our homeland, our allies, partners, and interests overseas. So domestic investment in high technology and military capabilities, emphasizing the use of the private sector. And from my experience in my former employer, the penetration of this investment at home in institutions of higher education. And this means, of course, increasing profits for the Big Five and other military contractors, particularly Lockheed and Raytheon. And I mention as an aside that Purdue University has a new large contract with Raytheon to produce semiconductors. And recently, the university gave an honorary degree to the president of Raytheon, who, as you know, was quoted, and the quote went viral, how much the Ukraine war was going to be advantageous to the profit margin of Raytheon. I would point out as well, since I am sort of zero in on higher education, that a recent webinar, I think co-sponsored by Massachusetts Peace Action, had a presentation by two speakers who've done research on the extraordinary penetration of Lockheed Martin in major American universities. To use these universities as a source for basic research, as a source for training personnel who would then go to Lockheed Martin, and also Lockheed Martin indirectly or directly impacts on the nature of curricula in these institutions of higher education, so that this investment at home, as President Biden called it, has enormous consequences for institutions like educational ones and institutions of popular culture as well. And I think we ought to pay attention to that as we think about these issues. And here's another image of the connection between the political institutions, the military contractors, and the Department of Defense. Of course, we're all familiar with the idea of the military-industrial complex, or as Henry Giraud put it, the military-industrial academic complex. The Biden National Security Strategy document identified the need for the United States to continue its leadership of the world. The US as a global power, the US as a power in the Indo-Pacific region, the US as a transnational bond, and here the document was referring to maintaining the NATO alliance and our alliance system with our traditional allies in Europe and North America. It made reference to continuing US concern about developments in the Western Hemisphere, a more integrated Middle East, and finally, but not last, an increased recognition of the changes occurring on the African continent. And we know that Secretary Blinken and others have visited Africa in recent months with an eye towards challenging the influence of China on the African continent. And in addition, as I think Nick Terse has pointed out, the US has some kind of military presence in 30 or 40 countries on the African continent. The vision of hegemony remains basic to US policy. And here is a quote by David Sanger summarizing the sum and substance of the strategic document. He says, what leaps from the pages is the relentless focus on China. Much of the military planning described in the administration's document is meant to counter China in space, cyberspace, and at sea. Each of these arenas requires very different arms, software, and strategies than the push to contain Russia on the ground in Europe. The document describes a more aggressive U.S. effort to enhance cybersecurity and urges work with allies in the private sector to, quote, withstand attempts to degrade our shared technology advances by limiting Chinese and other investment in the U.S. and controlling exports of key technologies to China. So Sanger, who is a sort of a inside the Beltway reporter on foreign policy issues with the New York Times, identifies the central focus of China in the identification essentially of the new Cold War as articulated in the Biden strategy document. But this isn't new. Years ago, I found this quote from the Washington Post from May 2016, while Hillary Clinton was still running for president. Hardly a day goes by without evidence that the liberal international order of the past 7 decades is being eroded. China and Russia are attempting to fashion a world in their own illiberal image. This poses an enormous trial for the next US president. We'd say trial because no matter who takes the Oval Office, it will demand courage and difficult decisions to save the liberal international order. As a new report from the Center for a New American Security points out, this in the United States and controlling exports, this is in the United States and controlling exports of key technologies to China. A few years ago, Alfred McCoy, a historian from University of Wisconsin, published a book with a title something like America's Declining Empire. And a centerpiece of his book, in his analysis, was China's rise to economic power on the world stage, such that the Chinese economy will be the strongest economy in the world by 2030. And McCoy argues that the position of the United States in response to this was to try and challenge Chinese economic hegemony by reinstituting United States military hegemony. Very interesting book, and it goes along very well with what we have been saying before. This was another study from the Council on Foreign Relations in 2019. And I'm interested in following the Washington Post, the Council on Foreign Relations, and other such think tanks and media sources, because I think they are real indicators of the thrust of American foreign policy and the vision and purpose and commitments of the administrations essentially that they serve. And these boxes, while relatively small to read, emphasize, again, this was a 2019 document, the centrality of scientific and technological needs of the United States, and the argument that the United States has begun to, quote, fall behind in these areas. And there was a need for us to recommit ourselves to scientific and technological developments. If you notice in the first box and the second row, US leadership in STEM education is declining. STEM is the shorthand that we use at universities like Purdue University: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And increasingly at my former university and many others around the country, there's been a push to transform the nature of the curricula to increase the role of STEM and decrease the role of liberal arts and humanities. And so this is an ongoing, almost day-to-day struggle inside major universities, and they comport with the increasing commitment of the leadership of these universities to give support to reestablishing US global hegemony. Here's a shorthand capsule summary from that Council on Foreign Relations report. In short, during the early years of the Cold War, Confronted by serious technological and military competition from the Soviet Union, the United States invested heavily in its scientific base. Those investments ensured US technological leadership for 50 years. Faced with the rise of China and a new wave of disruptive technological innovation, the country needs a similar vision and an agenda for realizing it. The more I thought about this quote and the rest of the document, the more I thought about the period right after World War II, when the United States was establishing the economic, political, and military institutions that were designed to create US global hegemony. And I guess I've come to the view that we're at a critical historical stage analogous to the late 1940s. And the consequences of those decisions made in the late 1940s were of long-standing impact on American political, economic, and cultural life and US foreign policy. One element Andrew Bosovich referred to as the creation of a permanent war economy. So we might want to get back to that in a bit. And of course, all of this is based upon the proposition of American exceptionalism. And this I took from someplace to suggest the irony of American exceptionalism is belied by a lot of comparative statistics on social and economic development across different countries. In addition, our committees of correspondence Move the Money Task Force had organized a webinar with Professor David Vine, who studies US military bases overseas. And this map from 2020 illustrates in part the US military presence on a permanent basis all over the globe. And Vine estimates that there's some 800 US military bases overseas. How all of this has been processed in the concern that we all have about the 2022 election. John Nichols wrote a piece, maybe he published a piece 2 weeks ago in The Nation, arguing that war peace issues, all of these issues from Ukraine to increased military expenditures to the self-concept of US global hegemony and American exceptionalism, all these issues have not been addressed very much in the electoral arena. But most Americans don't know it because the media isn't asking candidates about disarmament, diplomacy, and out-of-control military spending. I won't try and click on the article, but I think it makes an important point. And those of us who have been concerned, observing, or participating in local elections, I think would recollect that issues of international relations and foreign policy are virtually outside the collective conversation. And one of the things, in my judgment, that needs to be done is that this change. Now, about peace movements. I haven't seen you all on the screen yet, but I'm sure you all have been involved in peace activities, probably some of you for a very long period of time. And I think it's fair to say that peace movement solidarity has been intimately connected over the years with anti-racist, pro-labor, feminist, environmental struggles for decades. And spokespersons like Dr. King link the issues of war and peace to issues of social and economic justice. And I think we have to say that our collective peace movement efforts have had some successes over the years. But today the movement is dispersed, and I'll give some illustrations of it momentarily, and partially dispersed because of multiplicity of critical issues that face us all, that we're all concerned with. And it may be, however, that all of these issues in some way are interconnected. I put here my idea of a war system. You have, on the one hand, participation in war, what peace researchers call direct violence, and terrorism and responses to terrorism. And I'm thinking of the terrorism of US drone warfare and assassinations of people around the world. We have economic sanctions as a new kind of warfare. The 60-year blockade of Cuba is just one example. And I think we have sanctions against some 39 countries. We have the danger of return to the big power conflict that we began with over Ukraine, for example, and continuing increases in military spending with dramatic consequences for American domestic life. And I know some of you on the call are working feverishly to transform and make more just our healthcare system. That the lack of fulfillment of that is intimately connected with the enormous increase of military spending. So maybe part of our conceptualization as peace activists is to talk about a war system that has both international and domestic consequences. I found a site called Start Guide when I was writing a little essay about 6 years ago that listed some 500 progressive organizations in the United States. And it was an interesting and comprehensive list. And I went back and looked, and it's been updated. And let me see if it will show up. Here is just a broad list of groups in the category of peace and U.S. foreign policy. And you could see the categories in which they break down the number of groups. Here's Coalition of Peace Groups, General Peace Groups. I'm familiar a little bit with Peace Action, and many of us are familiar with Code Pink, and a variety of other groups that we're familiar with or identify with.
You need to switch away from your PowerPoint to the thing you're talking about.
Let's see.
It's good to be able to see you. Thank you.
Well, that's no bargain. Okay. Incidentally, I'll be happy to send anybody who's interested this PowerPoint. And I'm sorry if you couldn't see the list, but it's a pretty comprehensive list of ongoing peace groups in the United States. And you could go to this list. And if you're interested in finding out more about Code Pink, you click on Code Pink and it goes to their website. It's a very valuable resource, it seems to me. But one of the things that I take away from that in terms of this, this talk is the plethora of groups that are in existence, the variety of issues that they're concentrating on. So in a sense, I would argue that there isn't a paucity of peace activism, but maybe we need to figure out, struggle over how to connect these groups into more effective organizational networks. And one of the things that I was thinking about as I reflected upon all of this is that given the issues that I've described, maybe there are three axes of concern that are most important and perhaps would interconnect these variety of groups. One axis, we call axis one, big power confrontation. The US and Russia, the US back in the day, the former Soviet Union, and prominently the US and China. And how this big power confrontation is playing out over the war in Ukraine is obviously terribly critical at this point in time. Second axis has to do with what we might loosely call the global north versus the global south. And I will show a link to Vijay Prasad's incredible talk, but I don't think we have time to watch it, and I don't think I could get it to work. But a central argument that Prasad has made is that the traditional axes of understanding of international relations has been the conflict and or cooperation between big powers. And Prashad argues that perhaps the most important axis or dimension of conflict in the world is between the global north and the global south. And it calls up images of colonialism, neocolonialism, imperialism. It raises questions about what was called the debt trap and the response of countries of the global south and the UN to establish a new international economic order or a new world information order. And back in the day, there was a struggle over development of the so-called laws of the sea that had environmental consequences as well as consequences for the global south. And Prashad, as probably most of you know, has written a number of books on the cleavage between the global north and the global south. One of his early books called The Darker Nations was subtitles of People's History of International Relations. And he traces the development, the rise and decline, if you will, of movements in the global south for transforming international relations. And I guess I would argue, I think others have argued, that opposition to the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been rather tepid in the global south, because I think people like Prashad are saying that the countries and peoples of the global south see their primary adversary as the global north, the traditional big powers. At any rate, be that as may, axis number two involves issues of north-south conflict. And axis number three, that's so terribly important as well, is what Basovich calls a permanent war economy. And I list the names of some of the people who I used to read on this subject: Seymour Melman, Nick Turse, his contemporary, and Andrew Basovich. There's very interesting data in the Cost of War Project and the National Priorities Project on the amount of money that has gone into US wars. I posted someplace else a recent article from the Cost of War Project estimating that $19 trillion was spent by the United States in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan from 2001 till today. And many of us are involved in so-called Move the Monies campaign that are trying to build movements that shift national resources from military to social well-being. The implications of all this for peace work: say no to war. The danger of nuclear war is ever increasing. The Bulletin of Atomic scientists before the onset of the Ukraine war had set their clock till 2 minutes to midnight. And I found a quote even today that suggests that there's more talk about the danger of nuclear apocalypse now than this author has seen for years and years. Secondly, we need to identify with the global south, and many groups are engaged as a primary activity in solidarity with Cuba, with AMLO in Mexico, with Yemen and Palestinian people, and so on. So such identification and mobilization around these issues already exist. And third, we need to mobilize more effectively against a military-industrial complex, and perhaps include ideas about economic conversion. What are workers going to do if, in fact, we're effective in reducing military expenditures and investments? I think there are military contracts, someone once estimated, in 430 of the 435 districts, House of Representatives districts. And in the main, I guess I've come to the conclusion derived from my sense of the war in Ukraine is that there are really two superpowers in the world: powerful states and militaries and ruling classes versus potential and actual masses of peace activists around the world. So see, these are some of the implications that I glean from what I've said already. Dangers of failure. I thought about this last week. The dangers of not enhancing the effectiveness of the peace movement include the following. We will fall prey to a reinvention of world affairs like the onset of the Cold War. Remember, I talked about the late 1940s, the Truman Doctrine, so now it's authoritarian regimes versus democracies. The revitalization of NATO was established in 1949 and is being revitalized now. The Marshall Plan program and the establishment as China as the new Soviet Union, as the new number one enemy. And it seems to me that we have the potential of reconceptualizing, we being the United States, in 2022, the first period of the Cold War that had so much to do with transforming economic and political life within our country and between countries between the 1940s and the dawn of the new century. We will fall prey to an economic transformation from production for consumption and sustenance to production for militarization. Military spending, again, could become the number one priority of the society. I remember Melman saying in the 60s that 1 out of 10 jobs in the US had something to do with military expenditures, DoD expenditures. It'd be interesting to look at what that figure is today. Third, militarism will once again penetrate every domestic institution. Again, I see it in higher education. I see it in popular culture. If we sort of did a cultural analysis of mainstream movies and streaming series that we've all have been watching, I see a return to that kind of military cosmology that so much shaped the consciousness of people growing up, at least in my day, from the 40s on. The probability of environmental and nuclear catastrophe will dramatically increase. It's clear in the case of the environment. And again, there are people warning of the increased danger, possibility, probability of nuclear war, accidental or not. And again, maybe at my advanced age, I feel more vulnerable, but thinking back to the missile crisis of 1962, I didn't have the same feeling that I do now. Just as an aside, I have had occasion to teach U.S. foreign policy. And if one looks at the literature around the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were so-called back-channel negotiations going on. That is to say, even though the crisis was intense and very, very dangerous, there was communications between the former Soviet Union and the United States, and communications at several informal levels. And I just don't see that today. And finally, the impact of not developing a thorough peace agenda threatens the fragile but still existing character of American democratic institutions. Let's see, I wrote some more about these ideas, and I argued that we in the peace movement need to develop a kind of theoretical approach that sees the interconnections between our economic system, the military, and our ideology. So capitalism, militarism in the ideology of American exceptionalism. This theorizing should include highlighting this major cleavage between the global north and the global south. And our peace movement should utilize this kind of theoretical development to promote education as well as the pursuit of activism, organization, and active agitation. And it also should include even further engagement in global solidarity. Again, if you want to look at the details of this, I could show you, I could send you the PowerPoint. I commend this to you. I won't try and play it because I'm all freaked out about the technology. But Prashad, in this short vignette, I think he spoke at the COP26 meeting, argued that war is a crime. So of course the invasion of Russia of Ukraine is a crime, but also it's a crime that the fundamental resources of the global south have been historically and today expropriated for the global north, to the global north. And in part, the institutions created by the global north institutionalized the further exploitation of the global south. And he said, this is a crime too. This is a kind of war that we don't really talk about. So you could easily access this on YouTube. Of course, this is a fun old one where General Smedley Butler says that war is a racket. I spend most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. I suspected it was just part of the racket all the time. Now I am sure of it. I recently read a biography of Smedley Butler, and it opens with a narrative of a group of corporate CEOs going to meet with Smedley Butler to urge him to run for president against Franklin Roosevelt on a neo-fascist ticket. And Butler, although he did serve US imperial interests in China, in Haiti, in Nicaragua, and elsewhere, decided that this was too much. And finally, perhaps a moral of the story, we are not outnumbered, we're out-organized. And I think Malcolm had something to say about this. So, oh my goodness, this was the quote I didn't think I'd put in. I saw this today. I can't recall any time in the last 20 years where we've seen this sort of level of concern about the potential of nuclear apocalypse. So I hate to end with nuclear apocalypse, but maybe the times require us to do so. I'd rather end with Malcolm's urging us to get organized. So I'd like to stop sharing now, and hopefully many of you who have been at least as active or more active in peace and justice movements than me will have additional comments and additions. So thank you very much.
Well, and thank you, Harry, for a well-organized and thoughtful presentation. I'm sure there are many who will have questions that they will want to share. And if you are watching this on YouTube, you will be able to get your questions to us by sending an email to me at Global Justice Center, Global Justice Cliff @gmail.com. Put the word question in the subject line so I can easily spot it. But now, for those who are in the Zoom room with us, if you would like to raise questions, raise your hand, wave at me or something. And I see Lauren Langman has his hand up. He'll be first, and Darian DeLu will follow him. Lauren?
Okay. Am I muted?
No, we hear you. Now you're muted.
Back here, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Harry, how you doing? Hail to the green. Okay, first of all, I want to discuss the thing on Ukraine, but I don't want to open the can of worms and get into whether we should or we shouldn't, okay. Just one little side point. Both Modi and Xi have basically publicly warned Russia to back off. Okay, so we don't see unanimity on the part of the global South any more than we do here in the States. Now, like, I was a little bit surprised to see that one of my great heroes, Lula, basically came out very strongly for Putin. Okay, my question is really this, and it's a really interesting thing. I think everybody here on this list is well aware of the debate between the United States systematically act to provoke Russia in order to weaken it, because this has been part of American policy since the early Kissinger days. You covered some of that material. And there's no question that the United States is an imperial power. I think anybody watching this, I think most Americans even know it, although they frame it as bringing peace, justice, freedom, and prosperity to the world. Ask the Vietnamese and ask the Iraqis and the Libyans about the peace and prosperity that the Americans have brought them. But, the question is, though, on the other hand, the attack by Russia, which, as you mentioned, was a crime. Okay, the question is, and this is a problem for the peace movement, that and I have friends on both sides of the issue, and I mean good friends, not just casual acquaintances, but good friends that take very, very different views. It's a sort of problem, though, for what I'm trying to understand, and I don't understand it, is the problem that for those people that do place blame on Russia. And I could go off on an aside about 2010, 29, something like that. I was in Paris at a dissertation hearing of a woman who had given her dissertation, political science actually, on Alexander Dugin. And Alexander Dugin, if anybody's familiar with him, laid out the plan for a greater pan-Slavic, white, got to protect against mongrelization, or Russian Orthodox, homophobic Russia, and to restore the empire of Alexander the Great, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and all the other so-called great czars. Okay, the issue here is the problem that I can't really grasp is for those people. But half of my friends, or I don't know what the numbers are, basically blame Putin for believing that in 2 days he was going to take Kiev and put it in a puppet and leave. Okay, to be in the peace movement and support those the weapons produced by the contractors you mentioned, because we know that the things that have saved the asses, if you take, well, that's not the right way to put it, the thing that has given Ukraine a position of fight has been that's British, the NLAWs, the javelins that have taken out something like 1/3 of the Russian tanks, the HIMARS that have basically, overshot the Russians. I can go on and on and on, but most of your list, we've got a lot of the, the anti-radiation missiles, I think the United States has been supplying them with harpoons. No, the harpoons are coming from Sweden. But the point is to be about, how do you reconcile? We'll just for the moment say on the part of the people who oppose Putin, for example, oppose being a member of the peace movement and being glad that the weapons that have been produced, some of them, in the offices next door to you, or at least planned. How do you reconcile supporting, the right of the Ukraine, and I'm not arguing the position, but those who do, the right of the Ukrainians to defend themselves against an aggressive attack that was unprovoked, because as much as the assholes in the Pentagon may be vicious, nasty assholes, they are not stupid people. You don't get to those positions if you're a dumb asshole like our last president. I'm about to say late president, but that's wishing. Anyhow, they know that Russia has more nukes than we do. They know that most of them were little kids like you and me at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I will never forget those 10 or 12 days. I was so scared shitless. I was working on my dissertation at the time or something like that. I couldn't even concentrate because of what was going on, and we didn't have the internet to keep us going. Anyhow, my question is reconciling support for the Ukrainians, but at the same time, having to support the very industries that we oppose so much.
Cliff, are you taking several comments or?
No, why don't you respond to Lauren, and then we'll go on to Darian next.
Okay, Lauren and I both attended Senn High School in Chicago and graduated in June 1957. So we have that camaraderie, although we haven't debated these issues as I remember in all these years. I've come to the view, I'd love to skirt the issue of debating the history around Ukraine. But it seems to me there's blame to go around. Secondly, in conflicts, we know historically where there's blame to go around, the resolution of such conflicts either involve a horrific military victory of one side over another, or two, some kind of negotiated settlement. Consequently, I've fallen back onto some old social psychological literature, particularly a guy named Charles Osgood, who developed a model for negotiating among conflicting parties called GRIT, Graduated Reduction in Tensions. And he argues that when competitors, even though they have fundamentally opposed positions, whether it be intergroup like management and labor, or international between nations, have to figure out a way, or have some mediator figure out a way to get them to the table to argue and debate about ways to resolve the conflicts. The resolution of the conflicts, any resolution of conflicts, will not satisfy either party, and quote, virtually all issues have to be on the table. In the case of Ukraine, they have to include the Donbass region and Crimea. They also have to include, of course, as a precondition for negotiation, ceasefires. So my argument, as difficult as it might be, and as low a probability of success it might be the case, that all sides have to pursue negotiations. And some of the people, as you know, some of the Code Pink people have uncovered evidence that efforts at negotiation were underway last spring in February and March, and the U.S. side nixed the Ukraine government's participation in those negotiations. Therefore, I support one of the calls of protesters in these sort of mobilizations that have occurred over the last week: no war, negotiate. So that's one, that's I would regard as of great importance. Secondly, I see, from my point of view, the almost horrific consequences of dramatic increases in military expenditures. Again, my lens begins with just one crummy university, but I see it all over the country. If it's happening in universities, it's happening all over the public sector. And so I think our activities should be targeted against militarization and the recreation of a permanent war economy. Third, it looks to me like there are substantial peace movements in Russia. There is a pacifist movement in Ukraine. I can't judge if it's more than one person or lots of people. But I think our solidarity ought to be with peace movements everywhere around the world. And for those of us who were in the United States, we are more likely to have an effect on our government than making demands on other governments. So for these reasons, I think the position that Code Pink and Peace Action have taken, calling for negotiations, not war, demanding that the US not send more military hardware to Ukraine, to me makes the most sense. And I don't think, I don't say that because I think the probability of success would be great, but the situations are so dangerous. And add to that this discourse about nuclear weapons. Would they use them? Would we use them? Is it possible to use small nuclear weapons without it escalating to a complete nuclear war? The fact that we're having this kind of public conversation scares the hell out of me. And, so these, I don't know if this is an adequate response or assist to Lauren, but this is what I've been thinking about lately.
Harry, I completely agree with you on every point. But the point is that right now, and if you want to go back to social psychology, I'll go back to my original training as a shrink. You have a situation where, without naming names and stuff like that, you have two parties that aren't going to negotiate right now. That the demands for, Zelensky to get the hell out of every area of Donbass and Crimea, that's not going to happen. And
Somebody else has their hand up.
but the question I was raising was not the question you answered. The question I asked was, how do you reconcile supporting peace and negotiation and still at the same time, be glad that the Ukrainians are defending themselves? And I'm not saying that's my position exactly, but, it causes a real cognitive dissonance if you want to get into social psychology.
Darian DeLu had her hand up earlier, so she's next, followed by Peter Burgle.
Yes, I took my hand down thinking I would be speaking shortly, and it's distracting. The whole situation in which we find ourselves facing the use of terrible military weapons that are so devastating to all forms of life and the planet itself, and that this discussion, thank you very much, Harry, for acknowledging how serious the situation is and the increasing force of armaments, the basis of militarism as a way to resolve conflicts is increasingly, obviously, a problem. So I wanted to ask if you have ideas for how we get to the point of bringing pressure for diplomatic resolution, especially doing that at a time much sooner than we find ourselves, where there would have been more possibility. And time and again, this is a problem. And do you have particular suggestions? Thank you.
I don't know. I don't know if I do. I know Carl has talked about revisiting the United Nations. This is old stuff, but perhaps terribly important. What institutions exist in the world that at least theoretically are supposed to participate in conflict resolution? Encouraging the United Nations, the General Secretary of the United Nations to intercede, encouraging mediation and negotiation, encouraging a committee from among the nations in the General Assembly who presumably represent broader interests than just the great powers to try and intercede. If Lauren's information is correct about a possible constructive role for China, let alone Modi from India, that would be a positive kinds of developments. I think at our level, grassroots peace activists, organizers, I think our role is to mobilize people and demand some kind of negotiation. some kind of intercession of mediation. Perhaps it would involve some of our iconic figures in the United States taking an active role in calling for negotiations. I'm thinking of Reverend Barber, for example, as one person who should be pressured to speak out, not in defense of the Russian invasion, but to speak out in defense of avoiding nuclear war. I don't think what I'm saying is very satisfying, but
I just thank you for being so serious about the situation, which is so little discussed. And I think on some level, we in the peace movement have to reckon with the emotional burden with Women's International League for Peace and Freedom over 100 years of work, and look where we are. It's a pretty stunning prospect. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I might add, next week, Carl is going to speak on his hypothesis of the six-party system. The people that we would most identify with, loosely called the squad, are people I think we should put pressure on to speak out more vigorously for negotiation and into war. And I don't think they have enough. Even my hero, Bernie, has not spoken out enough.
That's true.
Next, Peter Burgle, followed by Carl Davidson.
Thank you for calling on me. I'm noticing that the title of this event is Rethinking the Peace Movement. And so far, it seems to me that we're not doing much rethinking of the peace movement here. We're just talking about the things that have been true of the peace movement all along. And one of the things that really seems very prominent to me is that none of the things that you're recommending that we do, Harry, are going to happen unless we get a lot more people involved. So unless we can build this movement to at least the proportions that it was in, say, in the 1980s when we were trying to stop Ronald Reagan and his efforts, I think somewhat successfully at that time, but we had the nuclear freeze and that kind of thing. So unless we can build the movement very substantially, I don't think we're going to have much an effect on anything. So, we won't be able to cut military spending. We won't be able to affect the war in Ukraine or subsequent wars of that sort. So I think focusing on movement building is what we really need to do. And I was hoping in saying that we were going to rethink the peace movement, that you were going to talk a little bit more about how we can rebuild the strength of the movement. So I guess I'll put that as a question to you, and also remark that I put in the chat a little while back some thinking that I've done about that, specifically about nuclear abolition. But I'd like to throw it back to you and say, how do you think we can build this movement to the point where we got enough strength to do something about it?
I feel so inadequate in trying to answer these questions because the short answer would be, I don't know. But what I've been thinking about is first John Nichols' argument or question, why is it that these important issues have not captured the attention of candidates running for public office? Secondly, one thing we can do more effectively is to theoretically connect domestic and international issues of war and peace, issues of military expenditures, with a women's right to choose, with healthcare. I think we've separated these issues to such a great extent that we have trouble conceptualizing their interconnections. I was on a panel in a place where I lived part of the time in Milwaukee, and a panelist introduced what she called the silo effect. There were a whole variety of political groups in Milwaukee, each doing good work on their own issue, but having very little networking and connection. And I'm sorry I was ineffective in showing that list of all the peace groups. You could check it out online. But there's a zillion different peace groups that concentrate on one thing or another. How do these peace groups connect? How do how does the No First Strike connect with military spending? And how do these issues connect with the drive for Medicare for all? So I think we could struggle to develop at the theoretical level, the fundamental interconnections, and then hit the streets with our analysis that shows how all of these issues are so important that we have to connect and work with all of them. And I think that's made even more difficult in the 21st century than back in the day when we were growing up.
I think when you say hit the streets, that's really the center of the problem, because our tactics here in the peace movement seem to be focused on either having webinars such as this one, or else going out and doing demonstrations, which are usually small and ineffective, and usually just one-off. So we're not creating any campaigns around the things that we are important, that we consider important. We're just we're just going from one demonstration to another. And I think that's really a big problem. So I wish we'd stop talking about hit the streets and start thinking about maybe going door to door, or start thinking about doing the hard kind of political work that happened around the demonstrations in the 1980s that built the movement to stop nuclear weapons development, and which were somewhat effective at that time. So every time that people talk about mobilize, peace movement people seem to think, or all left people seem to think about, what we've got to do is we've got to get people out in the streets. Well, I don't think that's doing it. I think we've got to come up with some other tactics. And the old stuff just is not really working anymore. How about looking at young people and thinking about how they communicate? Instagram, what's the other one? The one with the, what was that?
TikTok.
TikTok, exactly. That's what I'm thinking. Things like that. I mean, those are things that we have to be thinking about, and not keep thinking about, yeah, we're going to bring another 50 people out to stand out in front of a building and hold signs. It's just not working.
I totally agree with you, Peter. That just a word. I'm working on a committee called Move the Money, and our task is to try and figure out ways to mobilize people to get state and local legislative bodies to at least endorse resolutions to shift investments in military to social services. That's more concrete, that's local. It involves engaging politicians. It involves trying to organize, convince people to join our organization. I totally agree with your comments.
If you'd like to see the that list of peace organizations, we can screen share that now.
Cool. Hey, Dina,
Yeah.
could you get me the plug for this computer? It's on my desk.
In your study?
If we just scroll down a little.
Hey, slow down that scroll. You just zipped past all 2 of the women's peace groups.
No, did you get it wrong?
Is there a link to this list that we can get for ourselves?
Startguide.org.
What did you say?
Startguide.org. You can
What's-
see it. You can see it right up in the and up there. Startguide.org.
I can't see it and I can't quite understand. The first word is
Start as an START, guide as in Girl Guides in Canada .org.
I went there and what I see is not that list. So where is it on that page?
Well, you have to go down a little bit here. So whatever the next thing is, you know, there's probably more than one link once you get to the page. You
Okay,
want me to take on now?
Here it is. Somebody posted it on the chat.
I think peace and foreign policy is just one of the categories, right? So I clicked on, you know, there's civil liberties and environment and so on. So you have to scroll down to the subject area you're interested in and then click on it. And then the groups in that area will show up.
I'd like to
okay,
review.
well, Carl Davidson was next. And
Okay.
after that, then Norma Harrison.
There's a lot of complicated questions here, but I think the time to talk about negotiations is before the Russians invaded. That's when it might have borne some fruit to demand negotiations rather than an invasion. But to see if the Russians were up for any kind of negotiated settlement. At the moment, I don't think there's going to be any negotiations until one side or the other decides that it can't win. The Russians have not come to that conclusion, nor have the Ukrainians. We could argue that we want to compel the Ukrainians to understand that they can't win by cutting off any armed support for them. But I don't think that would be just a backhanded way of approving a Russian annexation of part of Ukraine, which is not a good idea. It's a violation of the UN Charter, among many other things. Very bad precedent to start redrawing boundaries by force of arms in the world. It's not one that leads to peace. It leads to greater troubles than you might imagine. So my feeling is that once it looks to me like Russia's in great difficulty right now. They've got themselves, clearly Putin bit off more than he could chew or he thought he might. And that there's a emergence of a anti-war movement among the Russian population generally, and especially among Russian troops, which are showing increasing signs of discontent at being put in the situation they're in. If that continues to develop, it seems to me that the Russians may be open to some kind of negotiated settlement, and the Ukrainians might too, once they see that they've got a chance to keep their country intact, more or less, and that with the Russians agreeing to a ceasefire, they don't have to agree to a complete withdrawal before the negotiations, but at least they have to be headed in that direction. I'm reminded of Vietnam, where the Vietnamese agreed to negotiate and to fight at the same time, but only after they'd gotten to the point where the tide had turned, and that it was clear that the U.S. was in no position to win. And that's when they were willing to go to Paris and have negotiations. So, given that circumstances, it seems to me, what can we do? I think there's a couple things we can do. One is there are forces in the United States who would like to fight this war in the interests of the U.S. rather than in the interests of Ukraine. And we need to combat those. And that is usually, the people who argue that we need to fight this war in order to weaken Russia or to bring about regime change in Russia. We need to oppose that view. Our aim should be the same as Ukraine's national interests, which is not necessarily to overthrow Russia, but to get them to leave their country and to agree to peaceful negotiations. So I think that we need to oppose that, and we need to oppose any adventurous policy whereby weapons would be given to Ukraine that would reach deep into Russia, which would quickly put the US and Russian forces in direct contact with each other. That would be an escalation of the war, which would, be one that we would not want to see. I think if we want some guidance on what we should be advocating, the thing I would do is look to the UN Charter, and especially to the resolutions that have been passed by the General Assembly of the UN General Assembly on the war, which has basically sort of spelled out the things that I've just spelled out. I will agree that the situation, there's a whole nest of contradictions involved in this, contradictions between NATO and Russia, contradictions between US and NATO, contradictions between NATO, Russia and the US, contradictions between Ukraine and Russia, and so on. But the real question is, which one is the principal one? And I'm convinced that no matter whether you think Russia was provoked or not, Russia was not compelled. You could say, well, Russia might have been provoked. That could be an argument. But Russia was not compelled to invade Ukraine. They did it because they thought they could get away with it, because they got away with it in Crimea. And they thought that they could knock it off quickly. And when they realized that they couldn't knock it off quickly, they said, well, maybe we can knock it off where we've been fighting for the last 6 or 7 years in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region, and so on. So I think that's the problem. The principal contradiction out of all of those is between the Ukraine people and the Russians. They're the ones that are doing the fighting, and you can argue that it's a proxy war. Many people argue that the war in Vietnam was a proxy war between the USSR and the US, but fundamentally it was a war of national liberation. And in this case, on the part of Vietnam, in this case, I think it's a war of national defense and to defend and restore their national sovereignty on the part of Ukraine. And I think that that's why the thing has gone on as long as it has. The Ukrainians have shown an incredible capacity having to do with a terrific morale on the part of their soldiers and their population generally to resist the Russian occupation. And I think it will go on. I think the thing for us to do is to think in terms of, again, like I said, the UN Charter, in terms of defining what is a good, objective, and all-sided position. But the danger of nuclear exchange is incredibly important. The Russians were the first ones to bring it up, and Putin's way of raising a threat. I think our job is to urge our government to ignore the threat, and what's more, to do more than just ignore it. That the U.S., we can demand of the U.S. that they take the no first strike pledge, not to be the first to use nuclear weapons. I think that's an excellent demand that we can make on our government in these circumstances. So the Lawrence question, I don't find any problem at all. I fought for U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam. At the same time, I had no problem supporting Vietnam's ability to arm itself by any means that it could in the course of the fighting. I didn't see any problem with it at all. Same way with Ukraine. I can demand that the Russians get out. I don't have any problem with Ukraine getting whatever it can get and thinks that it needs in order to fight for defense of its national sovereignty. Anyway, that's my views on the matter. I will make one last point. I think the peace movement. The peace movement. There are peace campaigns, and then there's a peace movement. I don't think there's going to be a peace movement unless there's a threat on the part of war that involves the U.S. itself and its own troops. That doesn't mean there can't be peace campaigns, especially urgent ones. And I think the main campaign that I would urge on the part of the peace movement today is a campaign around no first use of nuclear weapons, and to push for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. I think that's a critical campaign that we can wage at the moment. I don't think it's a good idea for us at all to argue for that the U.S. cut off arms to Ukraine. To me, that's just a shamefaced way of backing the Russian invasion.
Yeah, Harry, do you want to respond to any of that?
The only thing listening to myself talk about the Biden National Security Strategy document and recalling the statements in the Washington Post and the Council on Foreign Relations, and recalling the enormous increase in military expenditures, and recalling the media frames on issues of war and peace, not just Ukraine and Russia, but China and Venezuela and Cuba. I think for us in the U.S. peace movement, working against U.S. global hegemony is the number one task. And it's a task that ought to be designed to make people understand that their day-to-day well-being is intimately connected with opposition to the drive for U.S. global hegemony. So.
Okay, Norma Harrison is next.
Good. I'm surprised to hear Carl go on about the complexity of the times. The situation is simple. There has been continuous assault against, you're going to say, against the Bolshevik Revolution. Our owners have been frightened by that it came up in the form it did so very successfully, the revolution that it was, in spite of the struggle that it did to maintain itself, and then of course the overcoming of it by its own body. 110 years of assault against Russia / the USSR. You say nobody mentions it in their campaigns. Well, I'm a candidate for the school board in Berkeley. You could mute yourself and not cough into the crowd. And I don't have the money to campaign for president or senator or any of the main offices. So I do it for the school board. One of the things that I do is read from John Pilger's Silencing the Lambs. I posted the link to that in the chat. The peace movement seems to me to have been very ineffective. The horror that has been created by US hegemonic behavior is like, oh, you see, I can't speak of it. And you must understand that Putin, Putin did negotiations from 2014 on and before, and those were not agreed to. I'm insisting that Ukraine has to surrender and just agree not to allow the continued invasion through it against Russia, which has been going on. Putin has also explained that the West is trying to force him to say he would, with first strike, employ A-bombing. Putin has suggested that Russia would respond, only suggested that Russia would respond in kind. He has not promised A-bombing if things don't go the way that Russia wants it to go. And the last understanding that has to be done is that, in a sense, our owners are right to be afraid of the Bolshevik Revolution. Communism is creeping in throughout the world, which is why it's being battled against in successive, continuing places. People don't like, people get changed by the Bolshevik Revolution. They become liberated by it, whether they're able to practice its ideas or just observe the struggles of trying to. I've posted all that in the chat in case you want to look at it.
Okay, before we go to our last question, let me remind those on YouTube that you have a chance to have your say in this discussion too, by sending in an email to this address. But now let me call on Laura Langman.
Okay, I just want to be really quick. First of all, the communist Russia ended 20 years ago. And as I said before, and if anybody wants a good series of discussions on Ukrainian history, Timothy Snyder, he's a very mainstream guy, very mainstream thing. They've been running a very long history on history. But what I wanted to say—
the communist struggle did not end. That's the trouble.
Can I talk without being interrupted? I didn't interrupt you. You know, there are rules of politeness and decorum. Anyhow, my point is really that there was a presentation by a Ukrainian Marxist feminist. She teaches international political economy in England now. I don't remember her last name. Her first name was Yura. And she said, number one, that she finds it rather insulting that many people think that the Ukrainian people are puppets of the United States and NATO and have no agency and desires of their own. And we can go back into that history that I won't at this hour. And secondly, she said, and I'm quoting her, "We would take weapons from Satan if he'll help us defend our rights."
Okay, Harry, are there any last words you want to share with us?
You're muted.
You're muted.
Ukraine has so complicated the picture and so complicated our discussion that it's difficult to think about overcoming it. But I like what was said about organizing. I like the idea of reconceptualizing our issues so that international issues are interconnected with domestic ones. And I like the idea that, although it's late in the game, that our politicians be required to pay attention to issues of foreign policy and international relations. And I think we all ought to oppose the U.S. drive for efforts to reestablish U.S. global hegemony. And we ought to celebrate at least a vision of a multipolar world and try to achieve it. So.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Harry, for a very interesting presentation, and remind everyone that this has been recorded and is available on YouTube.
I can't copy the chat.
And pass word on to others. You can view this and previous webinars from our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. And next week, we are honored to have back with us again Carl Davidson, who will be talking about his six-party system hypothesis. So that'll be Monday, October 31st at 1 o'clock Central Time. And finally, let me thank our webinar team, Roberta Robles, Liz Mestras, Gregory Diamond, Bob Stone, Betsy Bowman, and myself. And now this is Cliff Durand signing off until next Monday.
Thanks, Cliff.
And we